44 Licking Pike, Wilder, Kentucky. A location to some that means nothing, yet to so many means so much more. A place where history is literally soaked into its structure, its soil, and its people. But what could have possibly happened inside its walls for it to have gained such notoriety? Well, I guess that's what you're here to find out. So let's do it. Together. Before 44 Licking Pike became the location we all know and love today. In the mid to late 1850s, it began as something very different. Swinging carcasses, the sounds of saw blades and machinery. Wilder, Kentucky's infamous location first started as a slaughterhouse, filled with blood and death behind every wall. Its operation did not last very long. However, it still left its stain on the earth. Inside this slaughterhouse was a hole. This hole was used to drain blood and dispose of animal parts during the operation of the slaughterhouse. This hole would become something of a tourist attraction in the future, given the name The Well. 40 years later, this business would shut down and become seamlessly abandoned. Or at least, so they thought.
The Investigative News Group presents the Geraldo Rivera Special. Devil Worship. Exposing Satan's underground.
Satanism, Satanism, satanic, Satanism, satanic, satanically, Satanism.
This old abandoned slaughterhouse would become a popular site for a local satanic cult. Already filled with blood and rich with death, it was the perfect location for their practices. Seances and sacrificial rituals were hosted in plenty at this location. But it was one spot in particular that caught the eye of the cult. The well was said to be used as an altar where this cult would open a portal to hell, and, unbeknownst to the surrounding population, they just might have succeeded without ever realizing. January 1896. Coming from rural Indiana, a 22-year-old music student named Pearl Bryan steps off her train ride in Cincinnati. It was a cold day, and she was wearing nice clothing with custom-crafted shoes. More importantly, however, she was currently 5 months pregnant. There were 2 men waiting for her at the station. First was her lover, Scott Jackson, whose child she was bearing. Second was his roommate, Alonzo Walling. Both of these young men were dental students, and Scott nor Pearl were prepared to bring a child into the world See, Pearl had come to Cincinnati looking for help from the two men in order to arrange an abortion. If only she knew what their true intentions were. Now, what happens next is a bit unclear, but is archived into public records. It is believed that the two dental students drugged Pearl and attempted to do the abortion with their own tools. Although, regardless of what the truth is, her fate was the same either way. The two men carried her barely breathing body across the Ohio River and into the gray forests around Fort Thomas, Kentucky, where they laid her body down and at the fifth vertebrae of her neck, they decapitated her. Pearl's body was found by authorities who were able to track and identify her by her custom shoes. Scott and Alonzo were taken to trial, where they argued to the very end that they took her to a local doctor who botched the procedure and left Pearl on the brink of death. But obviously, that's unlikely to be the truth. The two men were convicted and sent to the gallows, where they were eventually hanged. But there's one mystery in this case that has never been solved. What happened to the head of Pearl Bryan? Where is it located? Most authorities believed it's buried somewhere in the forest near where the body was found. Some people believe that the two men were a part of the local satanic cult and used her as a sacrifice. Although, there's one legend spread around the local area that people believe to be the truth. A few miles away from the crime scene on the banks of the Licking River sat an abandoned slaughterhouse from the 1850s. And inside this slaughterhouse lay the perfect spot to hide death and body parts. The well. As stated before, the case of Pearl Bryan's murder and the fates of the people involved is well documented and a matter of public record. However, there is still no definitive answer as to how and why the murder took place. It's a story full of mystery, full of cracks, blurring the line between truth and legend. Regardless of what is fact and fiction, the case is but only one instance of this location's dark history. A little over 30 years later, in the 1930s, the slaughterhouse was reopened as an inn called Bluegrass Inn. There were allegedly several people killed there, but the bodies were dumped elsewhere to avoid drawing attention to the illegal drinking and gambling going on in the building. But a few short years after opening, it was bought by a local in the 40s named E.A. Buck Brady, who turned the inn into a tavern and casino named the Primrose. Buck was a former bootlegger, made good, who didn't mind the nasty reputation, and lo and behold, he was running a very successful business. A business so successful that it caught the eyes of people Buck was hoping to avoid. In a testimony Buck had later given to the United States District Court, he was hoping that the rural location of the building would be enough to keep him away from the prying eyes of the Cleveland Four. The Cleveland Four were a crime syndicate with a lot of power and interest in Cincinnati. Unfortunately for Buck, it was not enough, and the syndicate was not interested in the man behind the business, but the business itself. Due to the success of the Primrose, it began to cut into the profits of mob-owned operations located in Newport. And in 1946, the Cleveland Four dispatched a man named Red Masterson to persuade Buck to move. Buck declined to do so and got the drop on Masterson with a shotgun, where he then blasted him in the leg. He was arrested soon after for disturbing the peace, however, escaped charges only after Masterson refused to name him at trial as the attacker. As soon as Buck was freed, the Cleveland Four continued their harassment, allegedly threatening not only his life, but also the lives of his customers. After a while of threats and harassment, Buck finally conceded to the mob, where later, in 1965, most likely due to the embarrassment, he committed suicide, and the Primrose Club was left to the mob. The mob reopened the building in 1947 as one of the location's most infamous historical operations, named the Latin Quarter. It was again remodeled and expanded, but this time as a swanky nightclub with dancers and food, in addition to the slots and gambling tables left behind from its previous occupation. The main floor hosted fine dining and shows. An attic room was hidden behind a secret door, and below, the basement had been repurposed with dressing rooms for the dancers and a little stone cell for those unwise enough to rack up debt. As expected, crime continued to rampage behind the business's walls, and the Latin Quarter was routinely raided by local policemen throughout the 1950s. In 1961, the Latin Quarter was finally forced to close. A few other businesses operated in the building, with the last being called the Hard Rock Cafe, and no, it has no connection to the current day chain. It was a biker bar that continued the location's history of violence, where it was eventually given the name the Bloody Bucket. However, after a series of shootings, it too was forced to close in 1977, where it lay abandoned for a year, waiting for the right person to walk in. Born in 1948, a tiny railroad town named Concord, was a man named Bobby Mackey. Mackey grew up singing endlessly, harmonizing to tunes on the jukebox in his father's grocery store. He would sing for his mother and the amusement of passerby railroad men. When he was 4, he won $5 at a local talent show, and at age 8, he was gifted a guitar by his brother, where his mom soon taught him how to play. After graduating high school, Mackey took a job as a railroad brakeman, and he continued to play in jam bands, making connections. When the railroad laid him off in 1970, he decided to do music full-time, performing in smaller bars located in Cincinnati. He contemplated moving to Nashville in order to stay close to the industry, but because he was married and had a baby girl on the way, it was a tough decision to make. Luckily for him, a pair of his friends from Wilder, Kentucky, informed and invited him to come take a look at a local property at 44 Licking Pike Road. The property he saw was not entirely new to him. In his days working the railroad, he passed this location fairly often while heading from his sleeping pad to the train yard. Now, for the first time, he was able to step inside the decaying building, and upon standing on its stage, he had a vision in his head. A vision of performing and turning the unbeknown historically eventful property into his own club filled with music lovers. His wife, on the other hand, was not a fan. She instantly disliked the facility, claiming she felt like someone else was there. Despite her feelings, in April of the same year, 1978, he and his wife Janet had bought the club with the name Bobby Mackey's Music World. One day before the club's opening, a 5.5-month pregnant Janet Mackey found herself alone on the second floor, sweeping the landing in front of the staircase, where she would claim to have one of her most terrifying encounters. Why don't I let her explain it?
Jerry Springer, and I'm standing in a nightclub that people insist has been haunted for years. Today we'll meet those people who say they've been terrorized by demons, spirits, devils, and ghosts. The owner's wife was carried across a room and thrown down a flight of stairs by a ghost. The caretaker claims the spirits lived in his body until the night he experienced a violent exorcism. Do you believe in ghosts? If you don't, you just might change your mind after today's show.
Years back, country music singer Bobby Mackey bought himself his very own honky-tonk saloon. While preparing for the grand opening, his pregnant wife, Janet, had her first run-in with a ghost. Janet, describe what happened to you.
Well, Jerry, I was upstairs and just checking around, making sure everything was, getting prepared to open. And something grabbed me around the waist. And it was so much pressure and force that I could not get loose. So I was picked up and carried almost to the door to where you go down the stairs and dropped on the floor. And then I got loose from it somehow and went on to the top of the steps and fell down again.
Were you screaming out?
Well, I was trying to scream out, and I couldn't.
Did you turn around and look who's carrying you?
Right. I turned around. There was nothing there, but still the force was there, the pressure and everything.
What time of the day was this?
This was like sometime in around noon or so, midday.
Just to clear the record, you had not been drinking anything?
No. I was pregnant.
You were pregnant?
I was pregnant.
Is it possible you felt baby pain, baby moving?
No.
You were literally picked up off the ground.
I was literally picked up.
You were thrown down the steps.
Right. Well, I was like pushed by something down the steps. I fell to the bottom. I was on my knees. I looked up, and there was a voice saying, "Get out, get out."
Were you screaming, crying?
And I was trying to scream.
You couldn't get anything?
I could not get nothing out, no.
Bobby, she's your wife. Are you buying this? Are you buying this?
No. First of all, I don't believe in ghosts at all. And we've been there for 13 years.
But that's not true.
Well,
that's not true.
It is true.
No. Believe me, Jerry,
we've been there for 13 years, and I have never seen anything or experienced anything. Why doesn't it show itself to me?
If he was pushed down the steps, then he would believe.
She's your wife.
No.
You're not believing her? You think she's making this up? She's lying?
She had been
No.
hearing these stories. She didn't like the place
I don't
anyway.
care.
She was terrified of the place
If he was
already.
the one pushed him down the steps and had
She
all
was
the trouble
terrified
I've
already.
had, then you would understand my side.
She had been
because
hearing
there
these
is
stories,
ghosts
and
there.
I think the power of suggestion, I think
Right.
she was looking for things
No.
like that.
That's not true.
So you think, are you saying she's lying?
No, I'm not saying she's lying.
Well,
I
you
think
might
she
as well
believes
be
it happened.
because you don't believe. and
She
I
believes
believe.
it happened.
Okay, all right.
So,
She does
Okay.
believe it happened, but
right.
but
It did
I
happen.
mean,
I don't believe it happened. It
Well,
did
how do you
It bothers
explain
me.
Janet's fall?
I don't know. I just don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe there's such
Well,
a thing.
there was something there to grab me.
Did you
and
wind
pick
up
me
in the?
up.
Did you wind up? What happened to the baby?
Well,
I went into labor at the incidents when I fell down the steps.
Yeah.
Pushed down the steps, and I got to the bottom.
well, it was later. It was
Later,
more the next morning.
About 8:30 that next morning, I had my daughter. The very next morning at 8:30.
One day, before the event of Janet Mackey's stair incident, Bobby and his wife were working on the club to prepare it for opening. They were soon approached by a young 20-year-old man who claimed he had worked for the previous club owner until a string of murders caused the business to be shut down. This man's name was Carl Lawson. Carl was a loner, and he stopped by to ask Bobby for a job at his unopened club. Not one to refuse help, Bobby hired him as an in-house handyman and allowed him to live in the second-floor room, where just outside that room rests the staircase where Janet had her incident. Carl, during an early conversation with Bobby, had tried to tell him the stories and legends of the building. However, Bobby was not interested and advised Carl to not tell a soul in order to not drag in the wrong crowd. Bobby was focused solely on music and wanted people who walked in the club to focus on the same thing. Carl agreed to his wishes, but due to his beliefs involving the building, he had developed a close friendship with Janet Mackey because of their paranoia. Carl stayed good on his word and never told a soul. But that all changed in 1989 when a friend of Bobby Mackey's walked in. A horror writer named Doug Hensley. Bobby was chatting with Hensley about his writings and began mentioning some of the stories Carl had previously told him about. Hensley shot up with excitement, and that same Friday night, he approached Carl, who at the time was operating the club's mechanical bull, and prodded him with questions about the stories. Carl wouldn't tell him anything. He didn't want to go back on his word. Hensley begged him, even confronting Bobby to give Carl permission to open up about the stories. After hours of going back and forth, Bobby finally threw up his hands and said,
Carl, tell him. You've been trying to tell me for years. I don't care.
Carl obliged and told Hensley about an instance when he and Bobby had discovered a series of holes chopped in the floorboards of the basement, where underneath laid a well, sunken and endless. Bobby chopped it up to be a blocked up shaft, but to Carl, it was a tunnel. A tunnel long, dark, and ominous. A tunnel to him that led straight to hell itself. Hensley used the stories gathered from Carl and other employees that he had interviewed. Even Bobby Mackey himself participated in order to clear suspicion on his own beliefs, where he was still not a believer in the paranormal encounters claimed to be happening inside the business's walls. Soon later, Hensley would release his first book about the building, titled The Terror at Bobby Mackey's Music World. Bobby originally had no worries with the release of the book as he figured it wouldn't go anywhere. But a strange phenomenon was festering across the country in the late 1980s. There was a growing hysteria with the central notion that shady networks of Satanists were conducting gruesome rituals on children. Law enforcement and media outlets took this idea very seriously, and many were falsely imprisoned on charges of satanic child abuse. Common murders were suddenly satanically motivated. Common paranormal and occult imagery of any kind, whether it was Halloween decorations or D&D source books, became proof that there were widespread dark conspiracies. Bobby Mackey's demon-haunted music club soon attracted many people's attention. Hensley's book gained press coverage, and big-name media were calling the Mackeys. In 1991, Bobby, Janet, and Carl were invited to appear on Jerry Springer. The next year, Geraldo. It was non-stop, and soon more people began approaching Hensley with stories in which he happily jotted down. Later, in 2005, Doug Hensley would release the final version of Bobby Mackey's book titled Hell's Gate: Terror at Bobby Mackey's Music World. During the increased momentum of attention in the 90s, Carl's stories began to change and become more dramatic. Hensley's writings revealed that Carl had begun talking to himself and reported he had trouble sleeping. He stated that the demons were attacking him in his sleep. He would hear marching throughout the building in the mornings. He would sleep with his door locked and a shotgun in his hands because he would hear voices in the halls. Soon after, Carl even claimed that he was possessed. Hensley had eventually invited a psychic named Patricia Michelle and a minister named Reverend Glenn Cole. Both claimed there was an evil trapped inside the building's walls. Patricia stated she had a vision inside the basement, by the well of a decapitated head lying at the bottom of its depths. She told Doug she had sensed two men that were trying to use Carl's body. With the Reverend in agreement, they both decided to perform an exorcism on Carl Lawson. Carl's exorcism was recorded and posted right here onto YouTube, uploaded by none other than Doug Hensley. I will show you some of this footage. However, it might be disturbing to some viewers, so viewer discretion is advised.
Because he knows that I've got something in me that's greater than him. And I've got something in me that's greater than you, Charlie. You understand that? You understand that? Huh? Oh, no. No.
Carl's fighting.
No.
That silly little son of a bitch.
You listen to me.
That silly little son of a bitch and Carl
No.
is fighting.
Carl is not that. Carl's a good person. Now, it's time for you to leave. Isn't it time for Charlie to leave? Huh? It's time for Charlie to leave. Charlie. In the name of Jesus, Charlie, I command you to leave. I command you to leave, Carl. It's time for it to be over. Your little game is over.
So,
Your little game is over. Your little,
Carl!
your little
Tell
game.
Carl!
No, you listen to me. I'm telling you. You don't tell me nothing. I'm telling you. Your little game is over. You've used Carl. You've manipulated him. You've done everything in the world that you possibly can, and it's time for you to leave. You understand me? Now,
I will, though!
no, you won't.
I'll settle down!
No, no. No, you're gonna leave.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you are.
I ain't going nowhere!
Yes, you are.
I'll never leave!
You understand me?
No, I understand what you're saying.
You understand
But you
me?
cannot.
You understand me? You're leaving. You hear me? Because I'm going to help Carl. I'm going to help Carl to live a life of peace.
Carl's not worth.
Yes, he is.
He's not worth the lives it can cost.
Yes, he is.
No, he's
Yes, he is.
Around the time of Carl's alleged possession, he had prominently mentioned seeing and speaking with a female apparition. A female apparition that would go on to be a sort of mascot for the building's hauntings. Her name was Johanna. The story goes, back in the 1950s, when the club was still in operation as the Latin Quarter, the owner had an alleged daughter working as a dancer at the club named Johanna. She was beautiful, and she always wore a very recognizable perfume. At the Latin Quarter, there was a man, a singer to be exact, that often performed. His name was Robert Randall, which, wouldn't you know it, Bobby Mackey's real name is Robert Randall Mackey. Johanna and Robert had fallen in love with each other, which Johanna's father did not approve of. In a fit of jealousy and disapproval, he ordered his lackeys to kill Robert. Johanna fell into a pit of depression. She couldn't stand what her father had done. Why would he do this to his own daughter she thought he loved? In response to her sadness late one night in the club's dressing rooms, Johanna poisoned herself, where she sadly passed away. This story quickly became the building's most popular legend. So popular, in fact, that Bobby Mackey decided to write a song about Johanna's demise, which became his most famous recording to date. Even so, there are many damning problems with the story of Johanna. For one, there are multiple renditions of the legend, making it very unclear what could be real and what's fiction. For instance, in some versions, it's said that her father was Red Masterson, the mobster who was shot in the leg by Buck Brady. However, there are no birth records indicating Red ever having a daughter named Johanna. The head of the Cleveland Four, who also ran the Latin Quarter, was Mo Dalitz. Dalitz did have a daughter, but her name was Suzanne. There's recordings of a Johanna Reagan who committed suicide via poison, but she was a housewife in Covington of 1914 before the Latin Quarter was in business. First of all, Carl Lawson, the man who claimed to have spoken with her spirit, also claimed to have found her journal and a poem written to her lover Robert. However, no physical evidence of this journal or poem has ever been brought forth. Even history itself goes against the accuracy of this story. The likelihood of a mobster allowing his daughter to dance in a nightclub is virtually impossible. In the early 20th century, saloon dancing was seen as a disreputable profession, and mobsters tended to keep their families separate from their work. Therefore, it doesn't make historical sense for this story to be true. However, despite its unlikeliness, employees and customers of the club have claimed to come in contact with the lonely spirit, hearing her sing and smelling the perfume she wore back in her days of dancing. Regardless of all the ghostly stories and claims of paranormal activity, Bobby Mackey's Music World continued to be not only a popular music club, but eventually a popular paranormal hotspot for tourists and ghost hunters alike. During the day, they gave tours telling stories of the alleged demons and apparitions who called the building home. And by night, a booming country music club where Bobby Mackey would perform to fans and music lovers. Janet Mackey and Carl Lawson, despite their demonic encounters, continued to work at the club, although in 2009, Janet Mackey sadly passed away, and later too in 2012, as did Carl Lawson. While sadly due to health and safety hazards, the original building was demolished on December 10th, 2024. Bobby Mackey's Music World has a temporary location in Florence, Kentucky, where the legend of the building's long history is still being passed on to future generations. Bobby still to this day claims that there were no ghosts, nor did he ever believe in the existence. But maybe you can go hear the stories for yourself and find out if the building truly was